Now I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about our presenters this evening, Matt Siegel and Alan Lightman. Matt Siegel received his doctoral degree in 2016 from the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIIS. He teaches courses on German idealism and process philosophy for the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program here at CIIS. Alan Lightman is the author of 6 novels, including the international bestseller Einstein's Dreams and The Diagnosis, a National Book Award finalist. He is also the author of 2 collections of essays, a memoir, and several books on science. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, Granta, Harper's Magazine, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, and Nature, among other publications. A theoretical physicist as well as a writer, he has served on the faculties of Harvard and MIT. And now join me in welcoming Matt and Alan.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for what I hope will be an intimate and deeply probing conversation with Alan here. Alan and I have had a few phone calls and email exchanges, and I'm really looking forward to digging into the ideas and experiences that you've shared in your book, your latest book. So before we get into the book, Alan, I'd really love to hear a bit about your own personal and professional journey. You're both a theoretical physicist, an accomplished theoretical physicist, and a best-selling novelist and nonfiction author. And that's an uncommon combination. One of my favorite philosophers, Alan Watts, who some of you may be familiar with, used to talk about 2 personality types, a prickly type and a gooey type. And the prickly type, they're concerned more with precise and rigorous logical definitions. The gooey type is more concerned with deep feeling and just living rather than explaining. You seem to strike a balance between those two, and I'm curious, I don't know if you are a believer in karma and reincarnation, but maybe there's just some biographical reason, if not a past life inheritance, that could explain that balance that you're able to strike. Do you want to unpack that? How is that possible?
Well, I love the adjectives prickly and gooey. That's marvelous. I was interested in both the arts and science as a child, and I think that a lot of children are. We have dual interests, and our parents and our teachers and our friends sort of talk us out of that. It's easier to go through life if you're either the artistic type, intuitive, spontaneous, gooey, or the scientific type, analytical, methodical, deliberate, prickly. And it's just easier to make a way through life if you're one or the other. I wasn't that aware of the distinction when I was growing up. I just did the things that I like to do. I like to play with chemistry sets and mix chemicals and build rockets, and also like to write poetry and take long walks. And when I got to college, I started feeling the pressures to go in one direction or the other, and I resisted those pressures and was very fortunate to have been able to make a life as both a scientist and as a writer. When I was at Harvard for many years, and then when I went to MIT, I went with a joint professorship in the sciences and humanities. And MIT allowed me to have that schizophrenic personality.
We would call it integral here at CIIS.
Okay, the integral. Okay, integral, that's a much better word for it. Yes, the integral personality. I do think that it is useful to keep the disciplines separate in some ways. I totally appreciate the integrative, interdisciplinary impulse, and it's important, but it's also important to realize that there are different kinds of knowledge, and we need different tools for that knowledge. And when we're taking a physics course, we really need to learn calculus and differential equations and thermodynamics, and we have to do that in kind of an emotionless way. And when we're taking a humanities course or an art course, we have to avoid quantifying because that's really not the essence of what it's about. And you do need different sets of tools. And so I think that we're right, that our educational institutions are right in having different disciplines in different departments. But at the same time, it's important that there be people who cross over and see the commonalities of the different things that people are interested in.
It kind of segues into my next question, which is that another physicist and novelist in, I think, the late 50s, C.P. Snow, lamented the divide in universities between the sciences and the humanities, and the way that scientists couldn't recognize a Shakespeare quote, and humanities majors couldn't recognize or couldn't explain the second law of thermodynamics, or at least recognize its importance. And he blamed our model of education for that division. And I hear you saying that, well, it's important to actually respect the differences between the way that science produces knowledge and the way that the humanities, various disciplines in the humanities produce knowledge. But do you think that division between the two cultures that Snow pointed out has that gap widened or narrowed, or where do you think we are in terms of how higher education handles this distinction?
Well, I think that there's more appreciation than there was in Snow's time of the importance of communicating across the disciplines. And there are a lot of academic departments now that have interdisciplinary courses, and the world is more interdisciplinary than it used to be. I mean, if you take something like the environmental problems, which of course you know a lot about in California, those problems involve biology, chemistry, sociology, ethics. There are just a lot of different disciplines that come into the study of problems like that. So it's important that the different disciplines have respect for each other and be able to communicate with each other.
Right. So your latest book, Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine, I finished it over the weekend. It was a marvelous read. Unlike so many of the forays into this conversation, at best, if not debate or argument between science and religion, you're able to find a way to respect the insights that each perspective offers. And when you look at the way that there's kind of a culture war right now between these two perspectives, these two worldviews. On the one hand, there are people who are very much on the side of science, and particularly in an age when somehow climate change denial, for example, is becoming more and more of a problem. And on the other hand, there's also a sense in which there's a sort of scientific or technological triumphalism that science and technology can replace religion and spirituality with rationalism and empiricism or what have you. And so I wonder, what was it that motivated you to engage in this fraught dialogue between science and religion? Are you unhappy with the way that scientists who try to communicate about science tend to engage with religious believers? What was your motivation, and what are you hoping to accomplish by entering into this dialogue?
Well, there have been a couple of motivations. One is that I think that science and religion have been the two greatest forces that have shaped human civilization. So it's been fascinating to me that no matter how science advances, and no matter how many questions that were once considered to lie in the realm of philosophy or theology, like how did our universe begin, even though some of those questions are now squarely within the realm of science, that there still is a very vital discussion and dialogue between science and religion. So one is the interest in these two powerful forces, and the feeling on my own part that they're both very important. When I speak about religion myself, and as I do in the book, I don't talk about organized religion. I talk about the personal spiritual experience. That's what's important to me. The other motivation is that in the last 10 years or 15 years, there have been a group of scientists and philosophers who are now called the neo-atheists. Richard Dawkins is the leader of the group, but there are other people.
Sam Harris,
Larry Krauss, Sam Harris,
Daniel Dennett.
Those are the most prominent, who have attempted to use scientific arguments to disprove the existence of God, or at the very least show that God is unnecessary. And people like Larry Krauss and Richard Dawkins have a condescending attitude towards believers, which is expressed in their writings. And I am, first of all, very put off by the condescending attitude. I think that we should have respect for other people's beliefs. But I also think that in terms of using scientific arguments to disprove the existence of God, that the neo-atheists are totally missing the point. That God is understood by most religious traditions lies outside of time and space, lies outside of the physical universe. God can enter the physical universe if he, she, or it chooses to do so, but essentially resides outside of the physical universe. And so you can't use arguments that are based on the physical universe, which is all science is. You can't use scientific arguments to either prove or disprove the existence of God. And I hold that view as I'm somewhere between an atheist and an agnostic myself. But I just think that it's futile to use scientific arguments to try to disprove the existence of God. And I think on the same token, you can't prove the existence of God either.
Right.
So those were I had a debate with, a public debate with Daniel Dennett in the pages of Salon magazine about this issue of whether science could prove or disprove the existence of God. And Dennett labeled me as an apologist for religion.
Oh boy.
So I'm certainly not defending religion wholesale here.
Sure.
I'm just saying that you're barking up the wrong tree if you're trying to use physical arguments to disprove the existence of God.
So in your book you reference William James's famous book, Varieties of Religious Experience, and you excerpt, I think it was a priest's recounting of his experience, mystical experience, And this quote ends with this priest saying that this experience, not a logical argument, but an experience, was the most proof that he had ever had of God's existence. And
Yes.
you also talk about your own
Mm-hmm.
transcendent or mystical experience in this book, and that if it didn't lead you to the belief in God, it at least, I think, allowed you to recognize and respect those who would interpret the experience in that way. And
Yes.
do you want to say a bit about what that experience was like for you, and if and how it changed your perspective on these questions?
Well, I think all of us have transcendent experiences, and by that I mean the feeling, the very vital, immediate feeling of being connected to something larger than yourself, and to feeling some unseen order in the world. That's what I call the transcendent experience, and by spiritual universe I mean, for me, the collection of all of those experiences. That to me is what the spiritual universe is. It's not necessarily belief in God. It's not necessarily belief in a divinity. It's not necessarily following the statements of organized religion. It's the collection of personal experiences that one has that are of that nature. And I'll just describe one of my experiences, but I don't think mine have any greater value than those of other people. But just to show you what I'm talking about personally, my wife and I spend the summers on a small island in Maine, and we all have our own boats because there's no ferry service or bridges. And one evening I was going back to the island late at night. It was after midnight, and I was the only one out on the water. And it was a dark, clear night, and the sky vibrated with stars. And I took a chance and turned off the running lights of the boat, and it got even darker. And then I took another chance and turned off the engine of the boat, and it got extremely quiet. So I'm out in the ocean. I lay down on my back on the bottom of the boat and looked up at the sky. So I'm the only one out there. It's still, and I'm looking at the dark night sky. And I felt like I was falling into infinity. And I lost all track of time, all track of my body, and I felt like the vast expanse of time from long before I was born to long after I will die was compressed to a dot. And I felt like I was connected to something, not just to the stars, but to everything. And it's a feeling completely without ego. And I don't know how long I was lying there, but at some point I got up and turned the engine back on. And I think that we've all had experiences like that. It may not be lying on a boat in the ocean looking up at the stars, but that kind of feeling. And that's what I call the transcendent experience. And I think that personal experience is the basis for a lot of religious and spiritual belief. For me, it's not what I read in the sacred books or what the church tells me. It's having experiences like that. That's what it's all about for me.
Right.
And you could have. I'm a scientist, and I do believe that the world is material, that it's all atoms and molecules. But you could have hooked up every neuron of my brain to a computer and read out every electrical impulse of every neuron while I was lying in that boat having that experience, and taken all of that data, and you would not have understood the experience with all of that data.
Right. I want to get to this question of the place of consciousness in a material universe in a few minutes here.
All right. Well, I'm sorry if I've jumped ahead.
Oh, no. We can go out of order. It's fine.
Yeah.
But, Plato talked about the stars in a number of his dialogues as the teachers of human beings. And in many ways, the origins of our ability to track the seasons and our understanding of time, and of course, the scientific revolution itself was birthed out of using new observational technologies to observe what's going on up there. And your book starts with this meditation while you're in a cave in France, which has these 17,000-year-old paintings of animals, and you were sort of ruminating on what the experience of these primal human beings must have been, just observing the natural world around them, observing the night sky before electricity, so that it didn't matter where you were, you could always see the Milky Way and the stars above. And it seems like in the modern period, with electricity and the hustle and bustle of all the things going on in the horizontal realm, we've forgotten our
We've lost a lot of that.
And one of the things that science has revealed that I find to be quite spiritual, if not religiously provocative, is the idea that we're actually the stars are our ancestors. We're the children of stars.
All the atoms in our bodies were made in stars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you think that there is actually a spirituality that can be derived from the scientific view of the universe? That we're just beginning to articulate what that new kind of spirituality might look like?
Well, I think the fact that modern science believes that all of the atoms in our body heavier than hydrogen is the lightest atom, but then you go up to helium and then lithium and carbon and so on, that all the atoms in our body heavier than hydrogen were made in stars, where hydrogen atoms collided and fused together that make helium, and then helium atoms collided and fused together to make carbon, and all of this happened in the nuclear furnaces at the centers of stars. And then the stars, some stars, not all, explode, and they spew out all of those heavier atoms into space, and those atoms drift for millions, hundreds of millions of years, and eventually coalesce and form planets, and then solar systems, and then new life. So if you could trace each atom of your body backwards in time, it would first go through your parents, and then it would go through the ground and the soil and the air, and then when you got back to a few billion years, you could follow the atom. It would be in outer space, and then when you got back to a couple billion years before that, it would end up, each atom would end up in some star. That's what scientists believe. I mean, we have a lot of evidence that that's where our atoms came from. That totally blows my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody who doesn't see something spiritual in that, they're just not, they're not awake. They're not feeling, they're not thinking about the significance of that. So that's pretty amazing. And that sort of connects us all. At least you can be a materialist. I'm a materialist. But I can follow each one of those atoms all the way back to a star somewhere. And it may not just be one star. There are probably several stars that exploded in our cosmic neighborhood that produce the atoms that are on Earth.
Right.
And that's pretty mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, well, me too. So the materialist perspective goes all the way back to ancient Greece, with the atomists, Democritus, and so on. But it wasn't until the so-called scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century in Europe that this atomistic, materialistic, mechanistic philosophy really exploded. And maybe it started with Copernicus, let's say, and his heliocentric model of the universe. And buried in a footnote in your book is a reference to a biochemist and a sinologist, historian of China, Joseph Needham, who asked this question after studying Chinese civilization, which during the medieval period in Europe, Chinese civilization was quite advanced technologically and scientifically, but for some reason what we think of today as modern science didn't emerge there. It emerged in Europe. And Needham asked this question, why is that? And
it's a great question.
He suggests that China, influenced by Taoism, had this more organic view of the universe, where the universe was understood to be something that grows, whereas in the West, influenced by Christianity, there's this understanding of the universe as something made, more like an artifact designed by a deity. And Needham was influenced by one of my favorite philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead.
Yes, I know that he's one of your favorites.
Yeah. And Whitehead also had an organic view of the universe. And Whitehead also was a student of the history of science, and he suggested that the reason that science, this mechanistic form of science that looks for the causes of material events, the reason it emerged in Europe was basically that it was a derivative of medieval theology, and the idea that there is a God who designed and created this universe, an omnipotent, omniscient God that really wanted to pay attention to every last detail. And the early scientists really thought that they were discovering the handiwork of God, and that mathematics was the language that God used to describe the universe. So what do you think about that historical perspective on the emergence of science? Not so much as a radical break, but maybe there's some continuity there, actually.
Well, I know that historians of science have pondered for a long time why science as we know it now originated in the West. And I think that there are other factors than the ones that you have mentioned that seem to me to be more direct. I'm not dismissing what you said, but I just think there are other factors. One is that that in the East and in the Islamic countries, there was a lot of emphasis put on the authority of the sacred books. And modern science does not accept authority of any authority. The only what science believes, starting from Galileo, Copernicus, Galileo on, is what we believe in science is what we can verify by our own experiments, and we don't accept given authority for what we believe. So that's the experimental method of science. The other factor to add to the ones you mentioned is more subtle, and that is that the Chinese philosophy, let's take China because you mentioned Joseph Needham, of having an organic view of things, that everything is connected to everything else, and part of that view is that things that happen are not caused by necessarily direct causes before them, but are caused by a confluence of accidents that happen all at once.
A kind of synchronicity.
Synchronicity. Mm-hmm. So the idea of organism or organicism, whatever the noun is for that, I don't know what it is.
Organicity.
And synchronicity, organicity and synchronicity, that precludes that's an opposition to thinking of the world as made of things that you can isolate, like pool balls on a table, and this pool ball moves because this pool ball hit it. Cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
But cause and effect, you can talk about cause and effect only when you can isolate individual objects. Object A did this because object B did that. You sort of draw a box around object A and another box around object B. They're separate objects that one affects the other. And that kind of reasoning, which is both the ability to isolate small pieces of a system rather than just keep always looking at the system as a whole, and the ability to establish causal relationships between things. That is antagonistic to the Chinese view, but it is also the view that allowed modern science to develop. It allowed Galileo's experiments with falling bodies and the formula that it takes for a body to fall a certain distance. It's the distance that a body falls quadruples when you double the time. Distance goes as time squared. That's a quantitative law. The kind of thinking of science allowed the development of allowed Alexander Fleming to isolate penicillin. It allowed us to develop quantum physics and produce computer chips that go in our smartphones. It allowed us to calculate the orbits of spaceships and land a human being on the moon. All of those things follow from the viewpoint of the world in which you can isolate, you can take a system and you can break it down into subsystems which you can study in individual parts and establish cause and relationships. It allowed what we call modern science, and that to develop in the West. I think that's just one factor. I think there were a lot of factors. So
Certainly.
if you add what you said to what I said, I think that those are some factors that caused this. I don't think that Western civilization is superior to Eastern civilization by any means at all. But I think that modern science, as we know it, came out of Western science.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Chinese, who still have all of their traditions and the I Ching and everything else, they use smartphones over there.
Mm-hmm.
The smartphone would not exist without Western science.
Do you think that in the 20th century, with the quantum revolution, that this notion of nature as a collection of isolated particles is still an adequate account? What do you make of quantum non-locality? Does it seem like, with the reductionistic methods of modern science pushed to their extreme, that actually what was discovered kind of contradicts at least the Newtonian model?
Yes, it does. I agree with you on that. And what we're referring to, Matt is referring to, for those who have not had a course in quantum physics, is that we found in the 20th century that if you go to very small sizes, atomic sizes, that particles behave as if they can be in several places at once. And that's called the wave duality of nature. Just like a wave is not at one point, it's spread out over a region, that particles behave both as waves that are spread out and localizable. And but it's harder, you can't speak of really isolating a thing when it can be in several places at once. I think that that that's quite true, but I think that our mathematics has sort of allowed us to go beyond the simple picture of isolated particles. And we are now, there's a lot about the modern world that has gone beyond our sensory perception.
Sure.
But I still would argue that the basic idea of cause and effect is still embodied in our science, including our quantum science.
So there's a sense in which what I hear you saying and what I understand is that the mathematics associated with quantum theory have run far ahead of our ability to actually picture or imagine what might be going on physically.
Yes, I think that's right.
Do you feel like that there's a need to come up with a better a picture that we could make sense of, or is it just the case at this point, at that level of nature, that the mathematics work and we should stop asking what the mathematics mean?
Well, I think we should always keep trying to ask what the mathematics means and trying to picture it, but I think we also have to accept the fact that our sensory apparatus is very crude. And there are wavelengths of light that our eyes can't see. We know that. We can build instruments that can detect X-rays and radio waves, but our eyes can't see them. And we can we can build other instruments that can show how time does not behave in an absolute way, that clocks in motion relative to each other tick at a different rate. We don't experience that in daily life. And as we have advanced in our science, especially in the 20th century with relativity and quantum physics, we have learned that our sensory experience of the world is extremely limited.
Right. Well, I mean, even with Copernicus, and people had thought that the Earth is stationary and the heavens are revolving
Right. Even with Copernicus,
around us.
right.
And already with Copernicus, the mathematical model, the geometrical model, is superseding our sensory experience.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
You're
it's
right.
pretty foundational to
Yes.
the scientific perspective.
Yes. That's I agree with you.
So there's a certain way in which the history of science is told and recounted that, as you were suggesting, that even these early scientists, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, they were not accepting the authority of ancient books, but looking for themselves and describing their observations and building theories and testing them. But it's also true that Copernicus was a Neoplatonist, and Kepler, who improved on Copernicus's model, was an astrologer and had a view of the heavens as archetypal powers, and that he was participating in their music, and that Newton was an alchemist, and Giordano Bruno, who was burnt at the stake by the Catholic Church. Usually it's said that he was burnt at the stake for his heliocentrism, but he was also a political radical, and he was questioning the divinity of Jesus, and so there were other reasons that he was burned at the stake by the Inquisition. But it seems like these early scientists were way weirder than is often acknowledged when the history of science is told.
Weirder in what sense? You mean that they had these other beliefs?
Yeah. So what do you think about that? Do you think that they were those beliefs were sort of just a holdover from a pre-modern, pre-scientific perspective, and that they just hadn't yet grown out of them? Or?
Well, I think that it's very hard to put our 21st century minds back into the minds of someone living in the 16th, 17th century. It's very hard to understand how those people were thinking. And historians have this problem all the time in writing history. But religion was a much stronger part of daily life and culture than it is in most parts of the world now. And so anyone who was educated like Newton would have also come from a religious background and would be expected to go into the church in some form or another. Mm-hmm. And so these beliefs, the Kepler's beliefs that the orbits of planets were representing the music of the spheres and God's plan, and Newton was also believed that the orbits of planets would not continue unless every once in a while God would take his finger and give them a little push.
Right.
That those beliefs were just part of the culture, and I think that everyone had beliefs like that.
Yeah.
It was part of the time.
Do you think scientists practicing today still have cultural beliefs that shape their
Oh,
interpretations?
I'm sure. I'm no doubt. But in terms of specifically religious beliefs, and people have done surveys that about the figure for the general public as a whole in the United States is that about 80% of people believe in God. I mean, whatever God means to the individual person, they would say, yes, I believe in God. And the number for scientists is about 25%. So there is a difference in religious beliefs between people trained as scientists and not. But I'm sure that there are many other cultural beliefs that we have, probably quite a few that we're not even conscious of.
Right.
That scientists would share as well as non-scientists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for Newton, when he would describe the behavior of planets in their orbits, or apples falling from trees, when he would talk about laws of nature,
Mm-hmm.
his way of understanding where those laws came from would make reference to God.
That's right.
In your understanding of the universe, as a materialist who is either agnostic or somewhere
Yeah. between
agnostic and atheist, where are these laws in a universe that's entirely materialistic?
Well, that's a great question. I think that there are certain fundamental laws, and if I just take, for example, relativity, Einstein's relativity, and the underpinning of that is there is no absolute motion, that all motion is relative. There's no fixed reference point in the cosmos against which you can measure motion. You can only measure motion against something else, but there's no invisible train station out there. Mm-hmm. I think that it's impossible to form a universe, and scientists today think that our universe came out of a quantum fluctuation, that's what we call it, but that new universes are coming into being all the time. I think that it is impossible to form a universe without a few fundamental laws it would be a mathematical inconsistency, like 2 + 2 = 4 and 2 + 2 = 3, both at the same time. Mm-hmm. A mathematical inconsistency. So I think that there are a small number of laws that are required for mathematical consistency of a physical universe.
Right.
And so when you ask where the laws came from, my answer would be that if you didn't have these laws, you wouldn't have anything.
Right.
I don't know whether that's a fully satisfying answer, because you could also ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing?
Right.
Which is an even more fundamental question.
Yes.
And that's a question that I have no clue about, but I think it's a very important question. Why is there something rather than nothing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was the philosopher Leibniz who first formulated that question.
Yeah.
And after several hundred years of science, the question remains.
Oh, I don't think that there's any way that we can answer that question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Unless, I mean, if you believe in God, then that might be an answer.
So it seems to me, in my reading of your book and my, cursory understanding of contemporary science, is that there are really two remaining mysteries or just big problems for the natural scientific perspective. One is the origins of the universe
Mm-hmm.
that we were just talking about, and the other is the nature of consciousness. And what is consciousness's place in the physical universe? Do you see these two problems as solvable or as intrinsically mysterious? And that at that point, trying to understand where the universe came from, why is there something rather than nothing, and trying to understand how consciousness could emerge in the context of an otherwise completely material cosmos. Do you see these as just intrinsically mysterious, and that the limits of science are such that an answer cannot be given?
Well, we're definitely up against the limits of science in those two questions. And science does have limitations. Science can't address all the interesting questions that there are. I don't think that science will ever be able to answer those questions definitively. But I think that there are theories of how the universe came into being.
Right.
And you can write down equations for that. And the late Stephen Hawking was one of the people who worked on this, how the universe came into being. But there are other very eminent physicists who've worked on this, and there are theories. We can't fully test those theories because we can't go back and see how it happened. On consciousness, I think that we will know more and more about how the brain works as time goes on, and I think neuroscientists have made a lot of progress in understanding how the brain works. There's still a huge amount that we don't know. But even if we do, let's say we did understand how all the neurons worked and how memory was stored and how the information was exchanged from one synapse to the next and all of that. We still might not be able to answer the question, what is consciousness? It could be, and this is actually my view, that consciousness is a name that we give to the sensation produced by all of the electrical and chemical activity of the 100 billion neurons and that 3 pounds of stuff up there. It produces a sensation, and that sensation is what makes us, we give that the name consciousness, we give it the name self or I-ness or ego. All those names we're giving to that sensation of all of those zillions of electrical currents and acetylcholine that's being exchanged between neurons. It's I think you used the word emergent phenomena. You can understand how all the individual parts of a system work, but if it's a very complicated system, the qualitative behavior of the system as a whole can be different than the behavior of the individual parts.
Right.
And consciousness is something like that.
So, assuming that it is some kind of emergent phenomenon, do you see, there's still a couple possibilities given that hypothesis. Do you see consciousness as something that is merely epiphenomenal? In other words, it's sort of like, I think it was T.H. Huxley who described it as the whistle on a train. It has no causal influence on how the train behaves. So consciousness then is this illusion that's produced by neural activity, but where we might think, we speak colloquially as though we could exert will to guide our own behaviors, but that's merely a way of speaking. Or do you see this emergent phenomenon as something that truly does have causal power over the body, over the parts of which it is an emergent product?
Well, I think it has causal power because you can willfully change your thinking about something. I mean, you can willfully decide, I'm going to stop eating broccoli. But I think that the activity of our brain that we're conscious of is only a tiny fraction of what's going on.
Right.
And I wanted to tell you about an experiment that was done 10 years ago by some German neuroscientists that is really frightening. And it's been reproduced and is pretty much accepted in the scientific community. They took some subjects and people and put them in front of computer screens and asked them to, they were given a choice between A or B every 10 or 20 seconds, and they had to choose A or B. Just like maybe one green button and one blue button, and you choose either the green button or the blue button. And when you've made the decision that you're going to choose the blue button on that round of the experiment, you press a button. So they while this was going on, they mapped the brain activity of the subjects. And they were able to locate the regions of the brain that lit up in the decision-making process. And they found that they could see those areas lighting up and even predict whether A or B was going to be chosen a full 10 seconds before the subject was consciously aware of having made the decision. Now, if you think about that for a while, it's really scary, because it brings into all of the great philosophical questions of free will versus determinism, and the illusion of self, because most people associate the self with consciousness. I mean, you have to be conscious to have a self, to have an ego. But what this experiment shows is that there's a vast amount of purely material, mechanical stuff that's going on, operations in your brain that you're unconscious of, but it's actually calling the shots.
Yeah.
So there's no driver in the cockpit.
And I mean, we've known, at least since Freud, right? That there are all these unconscious drives and motives that influence our behavior, and that the ego is not the master of its own house.
Right.
And neuroscience seems to be confirming that on a physiological level.
Yeah.
And there are some spiritual perspectives, Buddhism, for example, which would agree that the self is an illusion. But there's a sense in which, even if we describe consciousness as an illusion, that sensation that you were describing is still there. So somehow the brain is producing an illusion that is not material, because we're here experiencing it. Even if it's not a self which exerts free will, where does that sensation come
Well, we have the sensation. We know that, whatever you call it, the sensation is there. And, I'll take it.
Yeah. Right.
Whether it's an illusion or not, I'm happy with the sensation.
What do you think about the idea that this sensation is not merely a sort of peripheral evolutionary accident that we accidentally happen to experience, but that as material, physical beings, we are experiencing the intrinsic nature of matter itself, perhaps in a very complex form, but that there's something hidden to the objectifying methods of science when it looks at matter from the outside, that as human beings, we experience personally from the inside, and that it's perfectly fine for science to study the material universe as though it was just surfaces colliding that can be mathematically described, but that we actually have evidence of another quality of matter rooted in our own experience.
Yes. Well, we certainly have experience of what happens when you take 100 billion neurons and you connect each one to 1,000 other neurons. That produces this unusual sensation that we call consciousness. We certainly have experience with that. I don't know whether we have experience of what it's like to be a rock, for example. And a rock also has atoms in it, like the atoms in our bodies. But those atoms are not arranged in the particular manner that produces the sensation of consciousness, as far as we know.
Yeah.
They certainly have never told us that or spoken to us. And I think that consciousness probably operates on a continuum. That is, if you start with which animals much lower than humans, amoebas, and single cell animals, and you go up to human beings, and there's everything in between. There are crows and dolphins and dogs that emote and communicate with us. They probably have some level of consciousness that I think it's a continuum. And probably you need a minimum number of neurons and connections between neurons to produce a sensation which begins to rise to the level of consciousness. But one of the reasons I think it's a continuum is you can imagine deconstructing my brain. Let's say we take my brain and we could disassemble it one neuron at a time. So let's say we have some very skilled doctors and wearing gloves and scrub suits, and they start disassembling my brain one neuron at a time. Well, at some point, I will start getting disoriented. I'll maybe forget where I am. At some point, I will start losing some memories. I may not be able to speak. And gradually, everything that I associate with consciousness and with myself and my ego will disappear. And it will happen gradually, if they're taking, one neuron at a time. And of course, we haven't done this terrible experiment, but it happens with some forms of dementia, where people are losing their brain cells or their brain connections a little by little. And at some point, they're so far gone that they have no sense of self and can't communicate at all. But there's an intermediate stage where patients suffering from dementia can recognize what they're losing and can communicate that. And of course, it's a very grim subject, and I've had loved ones who have suffered from dementia, and probably some of you have as well. But there are websites where you can read reports of people suffering from dementia where they haven't, slipped over the edge yet. I have a good friend who's suffering from dementia, and she writes to me every month or two, and I can see that she's gradually losing everything that you would associate with the self and awareness. And so I do think that there's a continuum here, that consciousness is not an all or nothing thing, that it's really, I'm giving sort of the material explanation of it now, that it arises from all these neurons and connections between them.
So in a minute, we'll open it up for questions, but I have one more question for you, Alan. You reference the so-called final theory of physics.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's called the grand unifying theory.
Mm-hmm.
It would probably have something to do with unifying quantum physics and relativity. And do you think that, we've just been talking about consciousness, do you think that physicists could arrive at a final theory without answering this question of where at least the sensation of being conscious comes from?
I definitely do, yeah.
So that question is sort of extraneous, in other words.
I think so, but we should add the addendum that even if there is a final theory of physics, one grand equation that answers everything, we would never know if we had it, because you can never be sure, whatever theory you have in physics, that there might not be an experiment tomorrow that will contradict the theory. So all the knowledge we have in science is provisional. But before we do the Q&A, I just wanted to thank you, Matt, for being so incredibly prepared, articulate, bringing your own understanding, philosophy, and science, and the history of science to this conversation. That you've been really wonderful.
Thanks for letting me experiment on you, Alan.
Just don't
I won't touch your
disembody my
neurons.
brains
Yeah.
one neuron at a time. Please don't do that to me.
I won't. I didn't bring my gloves.
Okay.
So I'd love to invite some questions from the audience, and then afterwards, I think Alan's going to hang out to sign some books, so the microphone will be passed around. Go ahead.
I like what you were talking about just a minute ago about the rock being this coalescence of molecules in a structural way that's not crazily different from our own brain. But then you also talked about higher versus lower consciousness beings, states of stuff. Is it possible, do you think that maybe we are just the most human thing, and the rock is the most rock thing, and that we're sort of aligned? It's not as much of a tier of consciousness or a spectrum of more, it's just this is the human type of consciousness and that's the rock type of consciousness, and that maybe there is something there that's as interesting to a rock in its being as being human is as interesting to us.
Well, I mean, of course you could say that. I couldn't refute that. You have to put some metric on it. How does a rock exhibit its rockness? and how does a human exhibit its humanness? I would say that we exhibit our humanness partly by the art and culture and knowledge that we create, the relationships between people. That would be, the metric would involve that. I don't know what metric you would put on a rock that exhibits its rockness. But once you tell me what the metric is, then I will tell you whether I agree or disagree with you about the rock being a rock as much as we are human being a human.
Just to add another perspective on that, there's a philosopher of mind, David Chalmers. He talks about the zombie problem. We have no way of proving
that other people exist.
People are conscious.
Right. That's absolutely true.
You can look in the brain, and maybe we can distinguish in an fMRI a conscious person from someone in a persistent vegetative state or whatnot, but we don't actually know if those people in a vegetative state are having experiences.
That's absolutely right. And how do you know that? Why is it that everybody agrees that a certain smidgen on a piece of paper is the color yellow?
Yeah. There are trivial mysteries, and then there are big cosmic mysteries.
Thanks. Just two quick comments and then a question. One thing, talking about consciousness, we kind of haven't talked about maybe the obvious question or answer is somehow it enhances our survival as people and as humans, and that maybe survival, Darwinian ways of looking at this,
it would
give us some idea of consciousness.
We would presuppose that consciousness has a causal influence over the behavior of the body.
Right.
Otherwise, it doesn't help us survive more, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one point. The other point is the other important thing. I mean, Christianity and Eastern religions. Christianity existed for about 1,500 years before the scientific revolution. I think it's not a coincidence that Protestantism happened around the time of the scientific revolution. You talk about questioning authority, that was a big driver for that as well culturally.
Right.
So my question is, and this relates to what we were talking about, but also some things you said in the book, you talk about the transcendent experience, and that it's not subject to analysis. Yet, in a lot of what we're talking about here, we talk about the neuron patterns of the brain. Why isn't it possibly, at least theoretically, analyzable as a series of neuron changes that show that this is an experience that is a result of something that can be analyzed?
Well, I think that you could certainly have all of the information about what the neurons were doing while someone was having a transcendent experience. I mean, in principle, if you had, a massive computer. But for me, that would not convey the experience. It gets back to I think what we're talking about is emergent phenomena, that it's something that's not fundamentally reducible to its parts. And I think you can still say that everything is material, but at the same time believe that there are certain complex phenomena which are not understandable in terms of their individual parts. So that may sound like a contradiction, but that's what I think. That's my view.
First of all, thank you so much for a wonderfully inspiring conversation. It's really wonderful. I have a question related to his. How do you situate the transcendent experience that you describe and an extension, the experience of transcendence? how do you situate that within your description of consciousness?
Well, I don't know, but I know that some of the features of consciousness, like ego, self-awareness, which are part of consciousness as I think of what consciousness means. That during the experiences that I've had, which I call transcendent experiences, that I don't have that awareness. I'm not aware of self or ego when I feel like I'm falling into infinity. I'm not thinking about it. And the fact that I'm able to sit here and describe it later on probably means there was something in my mind somewhere that was recording the experience, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to talk about it. I wouldn't even remember it. But at the time that it's occurring, I am disembodied. That's the best that I can do. We can talk about these things only to a certain point, and then we can't really talk about them. There's no language for them.
You know, I would like to add kind of like a half-baked musing. When we get to this place, I always wish that science would dare to take a leap, which is to dare to conceive of a different notion of consciousness. For instance, I mean, this whole discourse about matter, the underlying assumption is matter is nothing but what science studies, right? So, I mean, why are we stuck there? Why are we stuck in this belief system, really, that consciousness is not a dimension of matter, right? I mean, the Western belief system is that it is not. So, funnily enough, and in a way paradoxically enough, it's a belief system that underlies science and how science understands matter.
Yeah, it's a belief system that has been extraordinarily successful. That doesn't mean it's all there is, but that belief system that matter underlies the world that we see and experience, that the world's made of atoms and molecules that bump into each other in cause and effect relationships. That belief system has been enormously successful. You may not even be alive right now without that belief system.
Yeah, but what would we lose? What would we lose by conceiving that consciousness is co-evolving with matter? What would we lose?
That consciousness is what?
Is co-evolving.
Co-evolving with matter.
Mm-hmm. What would we lose in terms of what you just described?
I don't think we would lose anything.
Voila.
What would we gain?
What would we gain? I believe we would gain a lot. We would gain an entirely different understanding of what is. I believe we would also gain the courage to really think, to evoke again our sense of awe, our capacity for wonder. I believe we would gain a whole lot.
I mean, matter can do some pretty magical things.
Yeah, I mean, I think you should give a lot of credit to what matter can do. I mean, those 100 billion neurons create Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and the Mona Lisa and The Tempest and King Lear and the theory of Schrodinger's equation of quantum physics. So
I want to press you a bit on this paradox, the way that the scientific imagination, the scientific intellect is able to explain so much about the nature of the universe based on these mechanistic models. Where does and how does science understand the possibility of that form of intelligence existing in a mechanistic material universe? How does science, in other words, account for the condition of its own possibility?
Well, I think that a lot of what we do. First of all, I don't think that science is all there is. So I would agree with you on that point. But in terms of science accounting for itself, that I think that most evolutionary biologists believe that having brains that could think was of evolutionary benefit. That we don't have sharp claws, but we have brains that are big enough to figure out survival strategies, and that our intelligence is a byproduct of having enough neurons and neuronal connections that we can survive by virtue of our ability to think.
So scientific truth then is a function of survival value?
Well, scientific truth, now you're talking about something else. I think that there's truth out there in the physical world that's independent of our ability to discover it or have knowledge of it. I think that the sum of the angles of a triangle are 180 degrees, whether there's a human being looking at that triangle or not. But I think that our ability to create civilization and to create communities and create science and create art, that is all a byproduct of having a brain, of having a survival strategy which favors a large brain rather than speed or sharp claws.
Whitehead remarks once that in his book Science in the Modern World, that if survival was the name of the game, matter should have remained in rock form because they live for millions of years. And he thinks that evolution is driven not just by survival, but by organisms' desire to thrive and to enhance and intensify their experience.
Well, there's also a lot of random events.
Sure.
Because in the primeval sea, when you had all of these organic molecules that were sloshing around and colliding with each other trillions of times per second in random collisions, then just by chance you would form cells, and some of those cells would eventually by chance form membranes, and you would eventually by chance form DNA and RNA that could reproduce. And all of that could have happened by chance, but once you have the ability to reproduce, then natural selection takes over and then everything happens sort of automatically.
But it's also entropy. Complex organisms are better at getting
Yeah.
higher entropy levels.
Yes.
Were there more questions? Here.
This is my last question.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah, so Alan, I was very interested by what you said towards the beginning of the conversation about there being great value in the dialogue between science and the arts.
Yeah.
And you spoke a lot about the benefits of this kind of reductionistic, causal scientific view on isolating objects.
Yeah.
But arguably, there are also limitations. For instance, say, our individualistic culture valuing each individual and their own success. And so I'm wondering if you see value in a similar sort of dialogue as you see between the science and the arts, between, say, the causal reductionist view and a more
Holistic view.
holistic, interconnected view. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yes, I do. And well, you're speaking of the individualistic. I mean, it's pretty well known that in Eastern cultures, that the group is more important than the individual. And there's certainly a lot of value to be gained from that, of thinking of a community rather than the individual people in the community. So, yes, I agree with you.
And do you see any ways that the dialogue between the more Western scientific perspective and a more interconnected growth view of, say, the material world could look?
Yes, I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And there are, in medicine, the field of medicine, for example, that there's Eastern medicine, acupuncture, that we know works experimentally. We know that it works. Western science hasn't been able to understand exactly how it works. But so I think that we have a lot to learn from each other.
Thank you so much.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you,
It was
Matt.
a real pleasure to be in conversation with you, and to everyone who joined and for your really probing, interesting questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a great, fascinating
Well, thank you,
conversation.
Matt. You made it work. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I think I'm going to sign a few books.
Yep.
If anybody
Right
wants
over
to
in the
get a
corner,
book.
right? Thank you, Alan.